Hello all, welcome again to today's lesson. In today's video, we are going to dive into complete full stack development using .NET, right? So in this video, we are going to start with the back end, right? We are going to talk about API, what an API actually is, all right? So we are going to talk about what an API is, the fundamentals of APIs, all right? Different analogies of using an API. We will also talk about the software analogy of an API, the real world usage, the endpoints. We also talk about the HTTP methods and how an API actually works, right? And at the end of this video, I'm also going to give you a mini exercise, right? So if this is what you want, if you want to go with me in this series, please join me as we start this lesson. Alright, so the first thing we'll talk about is the title. We need to understand what an API is and also the fundamentals of API. So these are what we're going to talk about. What is an API? This is for week A and API fundamentals. I'm doing this in series like I explained. So for this week, we're going to talk about API fundamentals, right? So what is an API? An API is simply application programming interface. Think of it as a messenger between two systems, right? We have system A and system B, right? So the API stands at the middle. It sends information from either system A to system B back to system A, or from system B to system A and back to system B. This is the simplest form of analogy of an API, right? Regardless of all the grammars of an API, this is just what an API actually means. Now let's talk about the simple definition of an API. An API allows two applications to communicate with each other, right? So we have application A and we have application B. So the API stands as the middleman. The API stands as the middleman to communicate between application A and application B. This is a simple definition of an API, right? So let's take a simple analogy of an API using a restaurant. Okay, I am the customer, so I go to a restaurant to take breakfast, right? So I meet the waiter. The waiter is the API. I tell the waiter what I want, and the waiter take my information to the kitchen, which is backend. The backend can be the database and all the rest, right? So API now fetches the data from the kitchen, right, and send it back to the customer, right? So the waiter here is the API. So this is a basic analogy of an API. This will actually help you to actually remember what an API actually means. So you never enter the kitchen, the waiter controls the request, alright? So the API becomes the waiter controls the request, the customer A and the kitchen. So this is an analogy of an API using a restaurant. So we dive into using the software itself, right? Let's say we have an application. The application can be a web application, it can be a mobile application, an iOS application, can be a desktop application, right? It can be any of these applications, right? Then you have the API and the database. So the API now stands as the middleman between the database and the applications, right? So you can have several data being fetched from the database and being displayed to your application just by the advent of API. So the API is the working engine that does this communication between these two interfaces. So for example, you want to check a balance, right? So user clicks a balance. So once you click the balance, the API now takes your request. Yeah, it fetches data and returns a response. Yes, so you take your request to the database and fetches your balance for you and comes back and returns your response. So this is actually what an API does in basic terms. Now, why does API exist? API exists in terms of security, controls, communication between systems. In terms of security, it helps you limit access to unauthorized use, alright, or from hackers. Then in terms of controls, this is where API actually serves as a strong base, right? So you have different controls. For example, you have a SaaS web app that does different things. For example, an e-commerce website. Now the e-commerce website will want to control how the differences between the admin and the user. This is for a basic one that you can understand, and also for a tenant application or web app that has different control systems where you have different levels of executive or different levels of controls. So this is how it communicates. And also communication between systems also helps to communicate between systems, right? So the real world usage can be used in mobile application like I rightly said, can also be used in websites, can also be used in payment systems and weather APIs and so much more. So this is just to mention but a few API endpoints. So what are really endpoints? This is what really helps the API to receive responses, right? So these endpoints target different particular aspects, of which we'll come to that particular point in the later part of this video, right? This is just an introduction. By the time we're going to the week 2, week 3, and we start getting our hands dirty, so we start understanding these things in real time, in practical terms, right? So here you see the get method, it gets the API and API fetches the product. So this is just a basic example of how an endpoint looks like. They have the request versus the response. Request. Now let's understand what the request is and what a response is, right? So the request, what the client asks, which is from the visual side that you can see, and while the response, this is what the API returns, right? So it usually returns in different format, but the general format that is being used is the JSON format. JSON simply means JavaScript object notation, right? So let's move on. Now this is the HTTP methods, right? These are the methods that help us to identify different aspects of a request that a user or the client wants to get. So you have the get method. The get reads the data, fetches data just to display the data, can fetch all the data or all the records, like you want to get total number of products in a store or an e-commerce store. This is what you use the get method. You can also get a particular set using the ID, right? Then the post is to create data, like you want to create a new product and all the rest. This is what the post actually does. Then the post is to update data, like you can see. So you want to update some of your data in the website or the web app. Visually, you just do the update, but at the back the API handles the request for you between you and the database for you to update in the database and make those changes and save them. This is what the API does. When you talk about the patch is to update maybe a part of the actual product itself, update a partial information. So that is when you use the patch. While delete, from the name you can actually see that you just want to delete complete data, then you use the delete method. So these are the basic idea. There are other more HTTP methods, but these are the 5 general ones that are mostly used and that you come across as you go along in your web development journey or back-end journey, right? So how an API works, like I rightly said, the client sends a request, it gets to the controller, and through the controller it goes to the services database, and the JSON returns the response. This is an example of a response. Like I actually said, most times it's being done through the ID, which is mostly unique. Depends, it must not be a number, it can also be alphabet, depending on how the naming system or convention is to specify that as an ID, right? So you have ID of 1 with the name, and the name of the item is a laptop, and the price is $2,000, right? So this is basically how a response looks like. In the final note, I hope you've learned something, understood what an API is, types of API methods, how different analogies of an API, how an API is being used, where they are used, right? I know you've gained value from this video. Please, if you do, I will greatly like you to subscribe so that as we post the next series, you will actually see it and come to watch them. So we have, like I said in the beginning, that we are going to do a mini exercise, right? So this is an exercise that we want to take in your own words, right? What is an API, right? And the number 2 is an API is dash between dash and dash, right? So put this in the comment section, and those that gets it right we get a great gift from, and those that gets it right we get a good gift from me, right? So here we'll end our lesson for today. In week B, now we're building our first ASP.NET Core API, right? This is where we start getting our head dirty. So I would like you to be prepared, and in the coming week B, this is what we are going to do. We are going to start actually seeing how these things work in real time, right? I know you've gained value from this video. If you have, I would like you to subscribe and also turn on the notification bell so that as I post this week's week B video, you will actually see it and also be the first to engage, and let's learn together. Until then, see you next time.